Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the support of viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, welcome to Illinois Stories. I'm Mark McDonald in Springfield at the Illinois Military Museum, where they have several activities coming up to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War. They were good enough here to show us through their permanent collection and also to arrange to have some of their volunteers interpret how Illinois' manpower was involved in the war. Richard Schatzik, on April 12, 1861, Fort Sumter was attacked, which started the Civil War. It's incredible how quickly things got started in Illinois, and I assume across the rest of the Union as well, but specifically in Illinois, how quickly men were called and how quickly they responded.
Well, the public was aware that tensions had been building for months, and once tensions actually broke at Fort Sumter, the governor, the adjutant general, quickly organized, sent out word that they were looking for new troops, and there were some militia units already in Illinois, Chicago, Springfield, that were able to return to the call very quickly. But there were people who were aware it was coming, had given some thought to preserving the Union, and quickly responded to it, and took the railroads and came from all parts of Illinois to Springfield to train, to recruit. And they started out the west side of Springfield at the state fairgrounds.
Now, you and your group have put together an encampment for us.
Yes.
A replica of an encampment for us. Right now they're doing some training in the background. This would be very early in the war. This would be in the first week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks of the war, when they're still mustering, I guess, in Springfield.
Yes. Veterans today are used to going to boot camp and to having months of training. That was not the case in the Civil War. Soldiers gathered at a place of recruitment, of training, and they received on-the-job training. Some of the officers, some of the NCOs had been part of local militia units and had some basic military training, but many of them had no training at all. It was on-the-job training. They would buy their manuals. They would study them the night before drilling with the troops. So it was a much different experience for the young recruits back then as compared to a soldier today.
Now, what is this military group that you represent?
We're representing early soldiers from Springfield area. There was the Springfield Zouave Greys that were a militia unit that the officers and NCOs might have been drawn from. We're representing just a typical group of early recruits who would have come out to the state fairgrounds west of Springfield. They might have been wearing state uniforms, which early on were gray.
No kidding.
Gray had a tradition in American military history going back to the 1812 war, that state troops wore gray to differentiate themselves from the blue worn by federal troops. And in the beginning, Illinois issued their troops gray uniforms until, I believe, early 1862, when the federal government obviously told them not to issue gray uniforms because
of confusing out there.
Exactly. And there are accounts in many of the early battles where the Union troops wore gray uniforms, causing confusion, but also some Confederate units wore blue uniforms. So that was quickly ironed out, as you can imagine. But in the beginning, it was very much of an informal, rushed together type of situation. Illinois had a militia of tens of thousands, but they weren't ready for the hundreds of thousands that would eventually fall into service. The federal government wasn't ready for the hundreds of thousands. No. So in the beginning there was confusion, making do with what was available, from uniforms to weapons, everything.
Lincoln called out for 75,000 troops right off the bat. In Illinois, Governor Yates was able to raise 4,000 troops just like that.
There, once again, the public was aware that this conflict was potentially coming. And when it actually happened, people were ready to respond. And preserving the Union was a big emotional factor for a lot of people, particularly the western states. They were part of the westward expansion and wanted to preserve the Union, and they were ready to respond to the call. And some of the young people in particular, it was a chance to get away from home, have a little adventure. They didn't really know the realities of what going to war would be. And that is some of the reasons why early in the war there was such quick enthusiasm to get involved.
Jim Patton, you are the lieutenant colonel of this outfit. We described a little bit earlier that when this group first would have met up in Springfield, they would have been out at the state fairgrounds, which is where the Du Bois School is now on the near west side. But logistically, that location just didn't work, did it?
No, it didn't. By the time the troops began to come in, there ended up being 4,000 troops at Camp Yates, where Du Bois School is today, and there just wasn't room. So then they decided to build a new camp out on the shores of Clear Lake, and that became Camp Butler, named for the state treasurer. So then troops were moved out there for training, and eventually later in the war, 2,000, 3,000 Confederate prisoners came in, and it was a concentration camp. And then some of the troops got moved back to Camp Yates.
Now, why did they choose Camp Butler? Why that location?
Well, one of the big problems was when soldiers are away from home, they like to drink, and they like to find ladies of the evening. And Springfield didn't like that. There were lots of problems here in town because, you think about it, Camp Yates, where Du Bois School is less than a mile from the center of town. And the boys were getting in trouble. So the officers said, we need someplace that's more remote. So they went 5 miles east of Springfield out on the river where it's a little more
Well, it also happened that the railroad line ran by there, and they could actually get those troops to the river and get them on a steamboat and get them south.
Right. Get them down to Cairo, Illinois, St. Louis, and then down to Cairo, and then on to where the war was, Kentucky and Tennessee.
When you look back at history, are you at all surprised at how quickly they were able to raise a fighting force and get everything moving?
I really am. When you look forward in history from there, we don't see the number of volunteers going to line up, to sign up, to go off to war, World War I, World War II. We don't see that like we saw in the Civil War. I mean, troops are showing up in Springfield almost immediately. The Springfield Zouave Greys, I think you'd been talking about before, had 30 members, and within a day they had 60. And finally, a couple of days later, when it reached 180, they shut down enlistment.
Wow. Well, Don Ferrix, for today, you're a sergeant in the Union Army, recently a volunteer.
Yes.
Going from Springfield to the south, and you guys were just doing some gun training, I noticed.
Right, we're doing some manual of arms training.
Manual arms training. The reason I wanted to talk to you is because in your hands you have an actual weapon that was used during the Civil War.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is not a reproduction.
It's not a reproduction. This is the real thing. This is a model 1816, made in 1823. 69 caliber musket, and this was originally made in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. This thing is it's all original, and you can see how big the bore is, 69 caliber. This originally had been a flintlock. And where this brass piece is here is where the pan would have been on the flintlock, where you would have put the priming powder.
Right, right.
But now, in the 1850s, they changed these, converted them to percussion. And there's a little brass cap that goes on there, and that's the igniter.
Okay. And the load that you would have used, now I'm holding a case here. I'm going to hand this to you.
All right, this is a cartridge box, and these things were designed to hold 40 rounds of ammunition.
Okay, just for that. So that's 10 on this side and 10 on this side.
10 on this side, and underneath here is 20 more rounds.
20 more below.
And the label here reads 60 grains of powder, Allegheny Arsenal, 1861.
So in each one of these packets, you've got your powder and your ball?
Powder and the ball.
Okay.
Here's the mini ball here. Then down here on this end would be the powder. And here,
I'll hold it.
that. What they would have to do, they'd tear the cartridge, pour the powder in, then break the ball away from the powder and put it in.
Got it.
And use the ramrod then to push all that down.
Now, this old weapon that was made in 1823, does it still fire?
Yes, sir.
It does.
It does.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And a soldier was required to 3 rounds a minute. That's pretty quick.
That's fast shooting and
That's
reloading,
shooting.
isn't it? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So this is very typical of what the 1st Illinois troops received in May of 1861 when they enlisted, took up the call, and when Lincoln put out the call for volunteers, and these would have come from the arsenal in St. Louis. You know, the state of Illinois got about 10,000 of them. So,
thank you for showing that to us.
yes.
Dwayne Carroll, early in the war, a corporal like yourself, would have had quite a few personal belongings with him compared to what they might have had later in the war. This is sort of what you started out with.
Absolutely. In fact, some guys even brought trunks to camp with them and had a whole array of equipment and then had to jettison it when they started going on campaign. But typically, a soldier would have a knapsack, and this is sort of typical, varied with the soldier, but they'd carry a spare shirt, spare pair of socks. Poncho right here was their raincoat, so they'd throw that on when it rained, and also use it at night as a ground cloth or to put over top of them to keep them a little bit warmer. Other items they might carry, a lot of the soldiers had what would be called a housewife. This was a sewing kit, so they'd have needle and thread in here because they had to do their own mending along the way. Carry a bar of soap with them. Candle along with matches, then carry a mirror, toothbrush, they'd have tooth powder, carry a towel, have a wallet with the $13 a month that they'd get
$13
for
a month.
Pay.
Wow.
The other items could be carried in knapsack or probably the haversack, which was basically where they carried their food. In camp, they would generally have a camp mess and be given meat, some vegetables. Out on the campaign, typically the ration was hardtack, like you see here, which was a hard cracker just made out of flour, water, and some baking powder. And they were made in large bakeries, very hard. Usually had to be soaked in water to make them soft enough to be able to chew. They'd also be given a ration typically of salt pork, which they'd carry with them. And then when they stopped, they'd cook it. A lot of times they just cook the salt pork and then put the hardtack in the grease and make a meal out of that. Not very nourishing, but that's what they had. And then they typically out on the march would go what they'd call foraging and go into a farmer's fields and grab apples, chickens, eggs, whatever else they could do to supplement their diet. As the war went on, and especially out on campaign, the knapsack got awful heavy, and when you're marching in the summer and it's warmer, a lot of times you jettison your overcoat, maybe jettison the poncho, anything to drop the weight down. And so a lot of guys, as the war went on, would just end up carrying a blanket and sling it over their shoulder and just throw maybe a spare pair of socks in with that and just count on having something sent from home to in case their shirt or their socks wore out.
Chris, Jeb, let's fast forward a few years now from the mustering in Springfield to, let's just say we're in Georgia, and maybe the last year of the war, okay? You are, in real life, you're a Park Service ranger.
Yes, sir.
But for these purposes, you're a corporal, and you're in a foraging party. And what your job is to do is to go out and get food for the larger army. Is that right?
Yes, sir, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
What's this little encampment like?
Well, what you see here is a typical foraging party, what would be existent, like you say, late war. We would be detached from the main army, and we would have multiple messes of men going out and finding food for like the larger armies. So
So these guys, for the most part, are not fighters. What they are is they just forage anything they can get, clothes, food, whatever they can get to bring back for themselves.
And then, I mean, we would typically run into, Wheeler's Cav. I mean, they were, Confederate cavalry was everywhere throughout the parts of Georgia there, and we would run into them. I mean, we'd have scuffs of fights, small skirmishes, but typically we would be sent out just, for our main goal was finding food.
Let's move a little closer and see what they're up to. Let's walk around there. Okay. So what they do is they feed themselves first, right?
Yes, yeah.
They go out and they find what they can. What's he cooking?
Oh, well, he's cooking a yam there. That was a very large source of food during that time. You also see he's got a source of meat, which is very, very, I mean, there's a small chance of finding a meat source during that time as well. You've got to imagine that, I mean, it just isn't 3 men, in an area. There's thousands of men in a 20-mile radius. So, I mean, you can also have to imagine that there's armies moving, and like I said, large sizes, but they've also got wagon trains as well. Now, Sherman's main point was to make as much damage as he could, moving through Atlanta. So
he's going fast, right?
Yes. He's not wasting any time.
Yeah.
He's actually left his wagon trains behind.
So his army, the supplies are way behind. He needs guys like this to go out ahead and get food for the army.
And it's very well known that the Western theater was full of well-stout men that knew how to fight. Very popular to Lincoln during that time too. He prided himself on his Western troops.
The distinction between the early army and the condition they were in and the supplies they had in this later army is pretty stark, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. I mean, what you'll see with the early war army is that excuse me.
It is smoky.
You'll see how their uniforms are clean. You'll see how the cuffs of their pants. I mean, it's very common to have soldiers' pants rolled up because the air could, come back up, because I mean, these uniforms are very hot. So, like I said,
hot and dirty, and they don't even match. They just wear whatever they can.
Yeah, that was another big thing while going through Atlanta. All their uniforms are wearing out, and day by day, more and more stuff is happening to where it's just wear and tear on all your clothes. And I mean, they'll come across the farm, they'll see civilian clothing, they'll take it. So I mean, it's very reluctant to find a soldier that's been stocked with fully issued uniforms and everything. So
thanks for this glimpse. Appreciate it.
Oh, not a problem.
Bill Lear, inside the Illinois Military Museum, you have a permanent exhibit of Civil War items, but it's going to grow a little bit during this 150th anniversary because you have some special items that you're going to bring out for people. But let's take a look at some of the really cool stuff that you do have here, because you've got some real one-of-a-kind items here, and I'm starting with this one because I just think this is so unique.
Well, it is. This is our Lincoln target board. It was Spencer came to the White House, and he wanted to show him this new weapon that he had. So went to the White House, got to talk to Lincoln, and they went out in the yard, and they both shot at a target board, and Spencer shot at it, and then they spun it upside down, and then Lincoln shot it from 40 yards, and he hit it, as you can see, 7 times in a row. 7 consecutive
shots. And this is
shots.
the very target board
that
Abraham Lincoln shot that rifle into, huh?
Right.
7 consecutive shots made by, well, he was pretty darn good, wasn't he?
Well, he was a shooter, and he liked to look at new weaponry, and he gave that back to Spencer. It was in the Spencer family till 1883. And then they donated it to the state of Illinois.
And there's a painting up here which depicts, of course, he's not 40 yards away at that point.
No,
but it does depict the activity. Can you imagine trying to get a firearm under the White House grounds now?
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought when I first saw this item.
How things have changed. But that's the gun and the target board.
No, it's just the target board.
Oh, okay. The gun is similar.
Right, it is similar.
Yeah.
But it's not the original gun.
Okay, now just over your shoulder. I love this because original flags from the Civil War are somewhat unusual. This one is particularly unusual because it comes from the 114th Illinois Regiment.
It does. It's a restored flag that we've had for a while, and we had it paid for it now. And the 114th, if you go out to the Lincoln Monument during the The summer, on Tuesdays, that is the regiment that represents, this flag. They actually have a reproduction of that particular flag, of this flag. So if you go out there and you watch those guys, do their ceremony,
right,
and then come to this museum, you will see the flag that the original 114th had. And you can tell the original flag, which was in the Hall of Flags for years, was not without, wear and tear.
Oh, and you can see how much of it is missing right here in the central part. Look, I mean, they had to put a, what do you call that backdrop they put on it?
It's just a shadow image.
A shadow image, right, because so much of it's missing. But it's remarkable that so much of it's still intact.
Oh, well, absolutely. And the thing about that is a lot of these flags in the 20s, ladies would come by, and if you look really close, they had sewn in this it like encapsulated the flag. And if you look, you can actually see a little bit of where it was. And for some of the flags that had really seen a lot of action, it really is what kept it together, kept it from completely falling apart over the years. So, in some respects, it's like, oh, that's too bad, but and it was why it costs so much to have these flags restored.
Sure.
But it's a beautiful flag.
Yeah. Now, speaking of action, here's a really good example of if you were in a battlefield. Of course, you wouldn't be standing still like this tree.
Absolutely.
But down at Chickamauga, this tree was standing still in the middle of a battlefield in between the North and the South troops.
That's right.
It took a licking, didn't it?
Well, and you have to, this tree is a great example of what it would have been like to be on a battlefield, during the Civil War. I mean, it's got grape shot in there. There's maybe some canister, and this stuff. I mean, if you look and you see the tree was even on fire at one time, and the miracle of it is that it was completely healed. I mean, it was healing up,
and it was growing.
Yeah, when these guys went back down and saw this tree, and they had been in the battle, so they knew, hey, this is a way to visually show people. Who've never been there or been in that type of combat, look what they went through.
Look down here at the bottom. Look at the size of that cannonball stuck in there. Can you see it at the bottom there? Yep, down there at the bottom. And then just above it, grape shot stuck in there. That's the story of the tree all the way around.
And can you imagine just the bravery to be able to stand there and take it?
And not run, to not run away from that.
I don't know. It's amazing.
Oh, man.
It's amazing.
Now, more brutality. Come on over here.
Yes.
You showed me this earlier.
Yeah, this is the bugle for Isaac Straw.
He was an Illinois man.
He was absolutely, and he was the bugler for the 32nd Volunteer Infantry, and at the Battle of Hatchie Bridge, he had this bugle, and the story goes from his daughter that a Confederate soldier came up with a huge Bowie knife and cut his hand. And he fought with the soldier, and he actually captured the Bowie knife. So when his daughter, years later, donated the bugle, she also donated the Bowie knife.
Really?
We have that down in the vault, which is very, very neat.
Now, I didn't know what a pike was until you opened my eyes. This is a Confederate pike here.
Right.
They call this a boarding pike, because you'd be on a boat when you use this, wouldn't you?
Yes, sir. This was captured around Donelson, in the Cumberland, and basically the pike, you would the one Confederate would have it. He'd reach out, they'd get real close to another boat, and they'd stick it in the wood, and then they would pull it close to them, and then everyone would jump on board. And of course, the soldier who had it in his hand, he's not going to have a rifle.
No, he's got no hands free.
Yeah.
This is what he has to fight with,
which is brutal at best.
Yeah. Well, it's brutal if you're countering him too, because can you imagine getting hit with that thing?
Oh my gosh, no. And speaking of pikes, we actually have something down in the vault you might like to see.
Can we?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's go.
All right.
The vault. All right.
Yep. Not too many people get to come into the vault.
Well,
here.
thank you.
So here we go. Pull this out here. Drawer 4. This is...
We were talking about pikes.
This is the John Brown pike.
The John Brown pike. John Brown, the abolitionist.
John Brown. That's right. This pike was made in Collinsville, Connecticut, by John Brown. If you want, 2 hands at all times.
Okay. It was much longer than this. It would have been as long as like 6 or 8 feet long, I guess, wouldn't it?
It was pretty tall, long enough to reach out and get you and keep you.
What was he
well
going to do
within
with
that.
these?
Well, intentionally, he was planning on arming the slaves and basically having a rebellion. And he thought that they would, if they were armed, that they would fight. And unfortunately, it didn't work out for him like that. He was captured at Harper's Ferry, and then these were in the South's hands. They were captured during the war, and then they were sent to Mount Vernon, Alabama. There was a fire in Mount Vernon, Alabama, and then they were sent to Rock Island Arsenal to be melted down to scrap.
And then they were saved.
Right.
Somehow.
The guy there knew what they were, and he actually sold them. A guy in Davenport, Iowa, bought this one and sent it to the museum back in 1884.
Remarkable.
It's fantastic, especially if you're talking pre-Civil War. I mean, this is where it's at.
Okay. Now, we also talked about Mr. Straw. Was his name Isaac Straw?
Isaac Straw,
the bugler,
that's right.
And you mentioned the fact that he got stabbed while he was bugling.
He did. This is actually
the Bowie knife.
The Bowie knife that stabbed him at the Battle of Hatchie Bridge. And
May I?
yes, absolutely.
Wow. That's a business knife, I'll tell you what. That's more like a sword than a knife.
Yes, it's very large. I couldn't imagine.
I better give that back to you. I'm getting willies.
Okay, and then I also have another artifact that I brought out for you because we were talking early war, and this is a knapsack. I have to be very careful because it's very
I won't
old.
handle that one.
Worn by S.L. Slemons. He's part of the Springfield Zouave Graves. Let me get this here.
We learned who they were earlier. Yeah.
Oh, okay, and he wore this at the State Fair in Jacksonville in 1860.
And then took it into war with him, I assume.
Well, the
You just don't know, huh?
the thing is about this one is we can't really find him in the record. So he was in 1861, but we can't find him in the Zouave Graves or anywhere else. After that point. So it's possible that because not everybody fought in the war.
Right.
It's possible that he got out.
Yeah. Well, he was a volunteer, but he doesn't. We don't know if he went in or not. But he may
Can't
well
find
have
him
worn
anywhere.
that in. He may well have. But
It's possible,
Yeah.
but it's very, very. And this is going to go on display on our in our Civil War exhibit. Let me set that down very carefully.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Among the additions to the 150th anniversary Civil War exhibit will be a Civil War cannon, fully restored. Those items should be available for viewing by the end of May. With another Illinois story in Springfield, I'm Mark McDonald. Thanks for watching.
Illinois Stories is brought to you by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the support of viewers like you. Thank you. For a DVD copy of the program you've just seen, send 1995 to Network Knowledge, P.O. Box 6248, Springfield, Illinois 62708. Be sure to include the program name, subject, and when the program aired. You can also order with your credit card by calling 800-232-3605.